Richard Blackwood sat in the back of his black sedan, scrolling through his phone as his driver navigated the familiar streets toward home. The business trip to Chicago had wrapped up 2 days earlier than expected, and for once, he felt pleased with himself. The deal he'd been chasing for 6 months was finally signed, sealed, and would add another $10 million to his real estate empire's yearly revenue. His phone buzzed with yet another congratulatory message from his business partner. Richard smiled, but the satisfaction felt hollow somehow. At 48, he had everything most men dreamed of: a mansion in the hills, luxury cars, vacation homes, and more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. Yet as the car pulled into his circular driveway, he felt that familiar emptiness creeping in. The house looked exactly as he'd left it 3 weeks ago. Perfect landscaping, pristine white columns, and windows that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Margaret had done an excellent job maintaining their image, as always. She'd mentioned something about hiring new help while he was away. But honestly, he hadn't been paying attention during that phone call. There was always something about staff changes, repairs, or social events that needed his approval. Richard pushed through the heavy front door, dropping his leather briefcase on the marble floor with a thud that echoed through the grand foyer. The house felt different somehow. Usually, returning home meant walking into complete silence, broken only by the gentle hum of the air conditioning system. But today, he could hear something unusual. Voices coming from somewhere deep in the house. Not just any voices. Laughter. Real, genuine laughter that seemed to bounce off the walls and fill the empty spaces of his carefully decorated home. Richard paused, tilting his head to listen more carefully. When was the last time he'd heard laughter in this house? He honestly couldn't remember. Following the sound, he walked through the dining room with its crystal chandelier and formal table that seated 12 but was rarely used. The laughter grew louder as he approached the kitchen, mixed with the sound of sizzling pans and clinking dishes. Someone was actually cooking, which struck him as odd since Margaret usually just ordered from their favorite restaurants or had food catered for their dinner parties. As he rounded the corner into the spacious kitchen, Richard stopped dead in his tracks. The scene before him was so unexpected that his brain took several seconds to process what he was seeing. His 16-year-old son, David, stood at the marble counter, flour dusting his black t-shirt, his usually perfectly styled hair falling messily across his forehead. But it wasn't David's appearance that shocked Richard. It was his expression. The boy was smiling. Not the polite, forced smile he wore during family photos or social gatherings, but a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. Standing beside David was a woman Richard had never seen before. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with warm brown skin and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners as she laughed at something David had just said. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a casual blue dress with an apron tied around her waist. She was showing David how to properly season a piece of chicken, guiding his hands as he sprinkled spices over the meat. "No, honey," she was saying, her voice carrying a gentle authority mixed with amusement. "You've got to taste as you go. Cooking isn't about following a recipe exactly. It's about making it your own. Here, try this." She held out a wooden spoon with sauce on it, and David eagerly tasted it, making a face that caused both of them to burst into laughter again. It was such a natural, comfortable interaction that Richard felt like he was watching strangers rather than his own son. "More garlic?" David asked, already reaching for the garlic press. "See? You're getting it. the woman replied, beaming at him with what Richard could only describe as maternal pride. Your grandmother would have loved teaching you this recipe. She always said cooking was about putting love into the food, not just ingredients. David nodded enthusiastically, hanging on her every word in a way that made Richard's chest tighten, with an emotion he couldn't quite name. When was the last time David had looked at him like that? When was the last time they'd had any conversation that lasted longer than a few polite exchanges? Richard cleared his throat, and both figures at the counter turned toward him. David's smile faded slightly, replaced by the guarded expression Richard had grown accustomed to seeing on his son's face whenever he entered a room. "Dad," David said, wiping his hands on a dish towel, "you're back early." The woman stepped forward, extending her hand with a warm smile. "You must be Mr. Blackwood. I'm Carmen Williams, your new housekeeper. Mrs. Blackwood hired me a couple of weeks ago." Richard shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the way she looked him directly in the eyes. Most of the staff they'd employed over the years had a tendency to look down or away when speaking to him, as if acknowledging some invisible hierarchy. But Carmen met his gaze with quiet confidence. "I didn't realize you were teaching David to cook," Richard said, his voice coming out stiffer than he'd intended. "Oh, I hope that's okay," Carmen replied, her smile never wavering. "David mentioned he was interested in learning, and I had some free time while dinner was cooking. He's actually quite talented at it." David's face lit up again at the compliment, and Richard felt another strange pang in his chest. How long had it been since he'd seen his son excited about anything? For months now, maybe even the past year, David had seemed lost in his own world, emerging only for meals or when specifically spoken to. Richard had assumed it was typical teenage behavior, something David would eventually grow out of. "He's been such great company," Carmen continued, turning back to David with obvious affection. "We've been talking about school, cooking, music, all sorts of things. You've raised a wonderful young man, Mr. Blackwood." The words should have filled Richard with pride, but instead they made him feel oddly hollow. Had he raised David? Really? Looking back, he realized most of David's actual raising had been done by Margaret, nannies, private school teachers, and now, apparently, by a woman who had known his son for only 2 weeks, but seemed to understand him better than Richard did. "What are you making?" Richard asked, moving closer to the stove where several pans were working simultaneously. "Honey, garlic chicken with roasted vegetables and homemade mashed potatoes," Carmen replied, checking the oven. David specifically requested something that wasn't ordered from a restaurant. He said he wanted to learn how to make real food. His words, not mine. Richard glanced at his son, who was now carefully stirring a pot of what appeared to be green beans. When had David ever expressed interest in real food? Come to think of it, when had Richard ever asked David what he wanted to eat? Their dinners were usually whatever Margaret decided to order or whatever the previous housekeeper had prepared according to a weekly menu that Richard had never bothered to review. "It smells incredible," Richard admitted. And it did. The kitchen was filled with aromas that reminded him of his own childhood, back when his mother used to cook Sunday dinners before his father's business took off, and they'd started eating at expensive restaurants instead of around their small kitchen table. "David's been telling me about your business," Carmen said, as she pulled a tray of perfectly golden vegetables from the oven. "Real estate development, right? That must be exciting work, building communities and helping families find homes." Richard blinked, surprised by her perspective. Most people either treated his work as boring or were overly impressed by the money it generated. But Carmen spoke about it as if it had meaning beyond the financial returns. "It can be," he said slowly, though I spend most of my time in meetings and looking at numbers rather than actually helping families. Dad closed a huge deal this week, David said, and Richard was shocked to hear pride in his son's voice. $10 million. Wow, Carmen said, looking genuinely impressed. That's amazing. You must work very hard to achieve something like that. There was no sarcasm in her voice, no hidden agenda. She seemed genuinely interested in his accomplishment, which made Richard feel both pleased and slightly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to discussing his work with the household staff, and he definitely wasn't used to them treating his achievements as anything other than expected. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Richard asked, trying to shift the conversation away from himself. Carmen's face softened with memory. "My grandmother mainly. She raised me after my parents died when I was young. Cooking was her way of showing love, and she made sure I learned everything she knew. I've been experimenting and learning new things ever since." "Carmen went to college too," David added eagerly. "She studied business administration." Richard raised an eyebrow, surprised by this information. In his experience, people with business degrees didn't usually end up working as housekeepers. There had to be a story there, but he wasn't sure if it would be appropriate to ask. As if, reading his thoughts, Carmen smiled. "Life takes unexpected turns sometimes. I'm actually studying for my real estate license in the evenings. Your son has been very encouraging about my career goals." Richard looked at David, who was nodding enthusiastically. "Carmen's really smart, Dad. She knows about market trends and property values and everything. We've been talking about how real estate can help communities grow in positive ways." The easy way David spoke about these topics, the excitement in his voice, made Richard realize he'd been missing something fundamental about his own son. David wasn't just the quiet, disinterested teenager Richard had thought he was. He was curious, thoughtful, and capable of engaging in meaningful conversations. Just not with his father. "Dinner's ready," Carmen announced, beginning to plate. The food with an attention to presentation that would have impressed the chefs at Richard's favorite restaurants. "David, would you help me carry these to the dining room?" "Actually," David said, glancing at his father, "could we eat in here tonight? At the breakfast table? It feels more, I don't know, more like a family dinner that way." Richard looked around the kitchen's breakfast nook with its simple wooden table and mismatched chairs, a far cry from their formal dining room with its mahogany table and crystal settings. But something about David's request, the hope in his voice, made it impossible to refuse. "Of course," Richard said, and watched his son's face light up again. As they settled around the small table, Richard found himself in an unfamiliar situation. For the first time in years, he was having dinner in his own home where everyone was actually talking to each other. Carmen asked him about his trip. David shared a funny story from school, and somehow the conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic. Richard realized he was learning more about his son in this one meal than he had in months of formal family dinners. David was funny, insightful, and clearly much more mature than Richard had given him credit for. And Carmen, she had a way of asking questions that made both him and David want to share more, creating an atmosphere of genuine interest and warmth that Richard hadn't experienced in his own home for longer than he cared to admit. As the evening wound down and Carmen began cleaning up despite Richard's protests that she'd already done enough, he watched her interact with David. There was something almost magical about the way she listened to him, really listened, as if every word he said mattered. She encouraged his ideas, challenged his assumptions gently, and treated him like a person worth knowing rather than just a kid to be managed. Standing in his kitchen, watching his son laugh with someone who had known him for only 2 weeks, Richard felt something shift inside him. The comfortable order of his world suddenly felt less comfortable and more like a cage he'd built without realizing it. The next morning, Richard woke up thinking about the previous evening's dinner. He'd slept better than he had in months, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the home-cooked meal, or maybe it was seeing David genuinely happy for the first time in what felt like forever. Either way, something had shifted, and Richard wasn't sure how he felt about it. He found Margaret in her usual spot at the breakfast table, reading the newspaper while sipping her morning coffee. She looked up when he entered, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the morning light streaming through the windows. "You're up early for someone who just got back from a trip," she said, folding the paper neatly beside her plate. "How was dinner last night? I heard you all ate in the kitchen." There was something in her tone that Richard couldn't quite read. Not disapproval exactly, but a careful neutrality that suggested she was waiting to see his reaction. "It was different," Richard said, pouring himself coffee from the silver pot their previous housekeeper used to prepare each morning. "Carmen seems very involved with David." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Involved how?" Richard sat down across from his wife, trying to find the right words. "They were cooking together, laughing. David was actually talking, really talking, not just answering questions with one word." "When was the last time you saw him like that?" "About 2 weeks ago," Margaret replied quietly. "Right around the time Carmen started working here." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Richard studied his wife's face, noting the subtle lines around her eyes that seemed deeper than he remembered. When had Margaret started looking so tired? "Richard," Margaret said, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate care, "we need to talk about David." Something in her voice made Richard's stomach tighten. "What about David?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "When was the last time you really looked at our son? I mean, really looked at him? Not just glanced up from your phone when he walked into a room?" The question stung because Richard couldn't answer it honestly, without admitting something he wasn't ready to face. "I see David every day." Seeing and looking are different things, Margaret said gently. "Richard, David has been struggling for months, maybe even longer." "Struggling with what?" "His grades are fine. He's not getting into trouble." Margaret shook her head. "His grades are fine because he's smart and he does what's expected of him, but he's been so sad, Richard, so angry and closed off. He barely spoke to anyone for weeks. He stopped hanging out with his friends. He stopped playing guitar. He stopped doing almost everything that used to make him happy." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. David played guitar? He tried to remember. The last time he'd heard music coming from David's room, but couldn't recall ever hearing it at all. "I took him to see Dr. Peterson last month," Margaret continued. "He thinks David might be dealing with depression." The word hit Richard like a physical blow. "Depression? But he's 16. What does he have to be depressed about?" Margaret's expression softened with something that looked like pity. "Oh, Richard, you really don't see it, do you?" "See what?" "You've been gone more than you've been home for the past 2 years. Even when you are here, you're working, taking calls, planning your next trip. David barely knows his own father anymore." Richard wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. He thought about the previous evening. How surprised he'd been by David's humor and intelligence, as if he was meeting his son for the first time. "That's not—" Richard started, then stopped. Because it was true, wasn't it? When had he last had a real conversation with David about anything other than school or basic logistics? "Carmen has been a godsend," Margaret said, her voice warming. "In 2 weeks, she's managed to bring our son back to life." He's talking again. Laughing again. He's interested in things. Yesterday I caught him humming while he was doing homework. Humming, Richard. I haven't heard him do that in months. Richard felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that David was feeling better, but also something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. A stranger had accomplished what he, David's own father, apparently couldn't. "What exactly has she been doing with him?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Treating him like a person worth knowing," Margaret replied simply. "She listens to him. She asks about his day and actually waits for the answer. She shares stories about her own life, her daughter, her dreams. She makes him feel heard." "Her daughter?" "Tiffany. She's 14. A freshman at the public high school across town. Honor roll student, apparently. Carmen works 2 jobs to support them both." Richard absorbed this information, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with how little he knew about the person who had apparently become so important to his son's well-being. 2 jobs? She works here during the day and cleans offices at night. She's putting herself through real estate school on the weekends. Margaret paused, studying Richard's face. "She's working toward the same career you have, Richard. Maybe that's part of why she and David connect so well. She understands ambition and hard work." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. David appeared in the doorway, his hair still messy from sleep, wearing pajama pants and an old t-shirt. He looked younger than his 16 years, and Richard felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. "Morning," David said, heading straight for the refrigerator. "Is Carmen here yet?" "She'll be here in about an hour," Margaret replied. "Why?" "She promised to teach me how to make pancakes from scratch today, real ones, not the mix kind." David poured himself a glass of orange juice, then seemed to notice the tension in the room. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine, honey," Margaret said quickly. "Your father and I were just talking." David nodded, but Richard caught the way his son's eyes flickered between them, reading the situation with the kind of emotional intelligence that Richard was realizing he'd never given David credit for. "I'll be upstairs," David said, starting to leave the room. "David," Richard called out, causing his son to pause in the doorway. "The pancakes sound good. Maybe I could— Would it be okay if I joined you?" For a moment, David's face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. "Really? Don't you have work stuff to do?" The question was innocent enough, but it hit Richard like a punch to the gut. When had David learned to expect that work would always come first? "Nothing that can't wait," Richard said, meaning it. After David left, Richard and Margaret sat in silence for a few minutes. Finally, Margaret spoke. "He asks about you, you know." "David. He asks when you're coming home, what cities you're visiting, whether the deals you're working on are going well. He's proud of you, Richard. But he misses you." Richard felt his throat tighten. "I'm working hard for this family. Everything I do is for you and David." "I know you believe that," Margaret said gently. "But David doesn't need more money or a bigger house or fancier vacations. He needs his father." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken truth. Richard thought about the previous evening, watching David laugh with Carmen, seeing his son's face light up when someone showed genuine interest in his thoughts and feelings. "I don't know how to talk to him anymore," Richard admitted quietly. "Every time I try, it feels forced, like we're strangers being polite to each other." "You used to know how," Margaret said. "When he was little, you two were inseparable. You taught him to ride a bike, helped him build that treehouse in the backyard. You used to read to him every night." Richard remembered those days, though they felt like a lifetime ago. Somewhere along the way, as his business grew and the deals got bigger, those moments had been pushed aside. There was always another meeting, another opportunity, another crisis that required his immediate attention. When did I stop being his father and start being just the guy who pays the bills? Richard asked. "I don't think you ever stopped being his father," Margaret said. "I think you just forgot how to show it." They were interrupted by Carmen's arrival. Richard heard her cheerful voice greeting David, followed by the sound of their laughter echoing down the hallway. The easy warmth in their interaction made Richard's chest ache with longing for something he'd lost without realizing it. "Richard," Margaret said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "I need you to understand something. Carmen isn't just our housekeeper. She's become important to David's healing. Whatever reservations you might have about their friendship, please don't do anything to jeopardize it." "What kind of reservations would I have?" Richard asked, though even as he said it, he knew the question sounded defensive. Margaret studied his face carefully. "I saw the way you looked at them last night, like you were uncomfortable with how close they'd become. I know your background, Richard. I know the world you grew up in, the attitudes your father had about appropriate boundaries between different social classes." Richard felt heat rise in his cheeks. I'm not my father." "Then prove it," Margaret said simply. "Because that woman in there has given us back our son. And if you do anything to drive her away because of some outdated notion about keeping staff in their place, you'll lose David completely. Not just his presence at the dinner table, but his heart. And this time, it will be forever." The threat wasn't delivered with anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. Richard realized that Margaret had been watching, worrying, and probably fighting this battle for David's emotional well-being on her own for months, while Richard focused on quarterly reports and expansion plans. "I would never," Richard started, but Margaret held up a hand. "Carmen is studying for the same career you have. She's intelligent, ambitious, and hard-working. The fact that she's currently working as our housekeeper doesn't define her worth as a person. David sees that. I see that. The question is whether you can see it too." Before Richard could respond, David's voice called from the kitchen. "Dad, Carmen's here. Are you still coming to learn pancakes?" Richard looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Go," she said softly. "And Richard, try to see what David sees in her. Try to see what she's given him that we couldn't." Walking toward the kitchen, Richard felt like he was approaching a test he wasn't sure he was prepared for. But David's excited voice and the sound of Carmen's warm laughter drew him forward, toward a conversation that might change everything he thought he knew about his own family. The pancake lesson that morning changed something fundamental in Richard's world. As he stood in his own kitchen, watching Carmen patiently guide David through the process of making batter from scratch, Richard found himself paying attention to details he'd never noticed before. Carmen didn't just teach David how to cook, she taught him confidence. When David accidentally added too much milk and panicked, thinking he'd ruined everything, Carmen simply smiled and showed him how to fix it by adding more flour. "Cooking is like life," she said, whisking the mixture smooth. "Most mistakes can be fixed if you don't give up too quickly." Richard watched his son's shoulders relax, saw the way David's face lit up when his first pancake came out perfectly golden. It was such a small moment, but Richard realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd seen David feel proud of something he'd accomplished. "Dad, look!" David called out, flipping his second pancake with the confidence of someone who'd been doing it for years, rather than minutes. "Carmen says I'm a natural." The pride in David's voice made Richard's chest tight with emotion. How many moments like this had he missed while he was traveling or locked in his home office on conference calls? Over the following weeks, Richard found himself making excuses to work from home more often. At first, he told himself it was just to keep an eye on things, to make sure the household was running smoothly. But honestly, he was fascinated by the transformation happening in his own home. David was becoming someone Richard barely recognized. And he meant that in the best possible way. The sullen, quiet teenager who used to grunt one-word responses had been replaced by someone who was curious, talkative, and surprisingly funny. Richard would catch glimpses of David and Carmen in the kitchen, garden, or living room, always engaged, in animated conversations about everything from current events to philosophy to David's dreams for the future. One afternoon, Richard was working in his study when he heard David's voice coming from the living room. He was reading aloud, and Richard could hear Carmen's encouraging responses. Curious, Richard quietly approached the doorway and saw David sitting on the couch with a thick book in his lap, while Carmen folded laundry nearby. "The way Steinbeck describes the Dust Bowl is incredible," David was saying, his voice animated with excitement. "It's like you can actually feel the desperation of the families who had to leave everything behind. What do you think drives people to keep going when everything seems hopeless?" Carmen asked, not looking up from the shirt she was folding. David was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I think it's hope," he said finally. "Even when things look impossible, there's always this tiny voice that says things might get better if you just keep trying." Richard felt his breath catch. When had David become someone who thought so deeply about literature and human nature? More importantly, when had Richard stopped noticing that his son was capable of such insights? "That's beautiful," Carmen said, and Richard could hear the genuine warmth in her voice. "Your English teacher must be impressed with observations like that." "Actually," David said, sounding slightly embarrassed, "I don't really talk much in class. It's easier to share ideas with you. You actually listen and ask questions that make me think even more." The casual comment hit Richard like a physical blow. His son felt more comfortable sharing his thoughts with their housekeeper than with his classmates, or his father. Richard realized he couldn't remember the last time David had told him about a book he was reading, let alone shared his thoughts about it. A few days later, Richard was in his study when he heard David's voice in the hallway, but this time he sounded upset. Richard opened his door to find David on the phone, his face flushed with anger. "You don't even know her, Brad," David was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "You can't just say stuff like that." Richard couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but David's responses made it clear that one of his prep school friends was saying something David didn't like. "She's not just the help," David continued, his voice rising. "Carmen is one of the smartest people I've ever met. She knows more about business and economics than half the people in our parents' social circle. And even if she didn't, that wouldn't make her worth less as a person." There was a pause, and Richard could see David's jaw clench. You know what, Brad? If that's how you really think, then maybe we don't have as much in common as I thought. David hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, his hands shaking slightly with anger. Richard stepped out of his study. Everything okay? David looked up, startled. Oh, hi, Dad. Yeah, everything's fine. Just, some people can be really ignorant sometimes. Want to talk about it? For a moment, David looked like he might actually open up, but then his expression closed off slightly, the way it always did when Richard tried to initiate deeper conversations. It's nothing important, David said, starting to head toward his room. David, Richard called out, causing his son to pause. What you said about Carmen being one of the smartest people you've ever met. What did you mean by that? David's expression brightened immediately. Oh, Dad, you should hear her talk about business strategy. She has all these ideas about how real estate development could be used to strengthen communities instead of just making money. And she knows so much about market trends and economic factors that affect property values. Richard felt a spark of genuine interest. Like what? Well, David said, walking back toward Richard with growing enthusiasm. She was telling me about how transportation infrastructure affects residential development patterns, and how developers who think long-term about community needs end up creating more valuable properties than ones who just focus on quick profits. Richard was genuinely surprised. Those were sophisticated concepts that many of his own employees struggled with. How does she know about things like that? She reads everything, David said proudly. Business journals, economics articles, case studies of successful community development projects. She's studying for her real estate license, but she's not just memorizing test material. She's really learning the industry. The pride in David's voice when he talked about Carmen's intelligence was unmistakable. Richard realized his son had found a mentor in someone Richard had initially seen as just household staff. That evening, as Carmen prepared to leave for her night job cleaning offices, Richard found himself in the kitchen at the same time. It wasn't entirely by accident. He'd been hoping for a chance to talk with her one-on-one. Carmen, he said, feeling oddly nervous. Could I speak with you for a moment? Of course, Mr. Blackwood. Is everything all right? Please, call me Richard, he said, then immediately wondered why he'd made that request. I wanted to thank you for what you've done for David. Carmen's face softened. David's a special young man. He just needed someone to see that and remind him of it. Margaret told me he was struggling before you came, with depression. Carmen nodded carefully. He's been carrying a lot of pain. Sometimes young people just need to feel heard and valued for who they are, not just what they achieve. The comment felt like a gentle rebuke, though Richard didn't think Carmen meant it that way. What made you decide to study real estate? Carmen's eyes lit up with passion. I want to help families find homes they can actually afford. Too many people think homeownership is impossible because the process seems complicated and expensive. But there are programs and strategies that can make it work, especially for first-time buyers. Richard found himself genuinely interested in her perspective. That's not where the big money is in real estate. Not everything worthwhile is about big money, Carmen replied simply. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is help someone achieve a dream they thought was impossible. Her words stayed with Richard long after she left for her second job. He found himself thinking about his own career, about the deals he pursued and the communities he'd helped develop. When had he stopped thinking about the families who would live in those homes and started focusing only on profit margins? The next morning, Richard made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of his usual early morning routine of checking emails and reading financial reports, he knocked on David's bedroom door. "Come in," David called out, sounding puzzled. Richard found his son sitting at his desk, working on homework with unusual focus and energy. "I was wondering," Richard said, feeling awkward but determined, "if you'd like to grab breakfast somewhere this morning. Just the two of us." David's face went through several expressions: surprise, suspicion, and finally, cautious hope. "Really? Don't you have meetings or calls or something?" "Nothing that can't wait," Richard said, echoing the words he'd spoken a few weeks earlier about the pancake lesson. At the small diner downtown, a place Richard had never been but David suggested, Richard found himself actually talking with his son for the first time in years. Not talking at him about grades or expectations, but talking with him about ideas, dreams, and observations about the world. "Carmen thinks I should consider studying business in college," David said over his stack of blueberry pancakes. "She says I have good instincts for understanding how different factors connect to create outcomes." "What do you think about that?" Richard asked, genuinely curious about his son's answer. David was quiet for a moment, cutting his pancakes into precise pieces. "I think I'd like to learn how to build things that matter. Not just buildings or businesses, but things that make people's lives better." Richard felt something shift in his chest as he looked at his son, really looked at him. David wasn't just a teenager going through a phase. He was becoming a thoughtful, principled young man with his own vision for what he wanted his life to mean. And Richard realized that Carmen hadn't just helped David discover who he was. She'd helped Richard discover who his son had become while he wasn't paying attention. More importantly, she'd shown him that it wasn't too late to be part of David's journey toward becoming the man he was meant to be. 3 months after that first breakfast with David, Richard found himself looking forward to coming home in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The house that had once felt like an expensive showpiece now felt like an actual home, filled with conversations, laughter, and the kind of warmth that couldn't be bought or designed. David had transformed completely. The quiet, withdrawn teenager was gone, replaced by someone who bounded down the stairs each morning eager to share something he'd learned or experienced. His grades hadn't just improved, they'd skyrocketed. More importantly, he seemed genuinely excited about learning again. Richard was reviewing some property development proposals in his study one evening when he heard voices coming from the kitchen. Following the sound, he found David and Carmen sitting at the breakfast table with textbooks, notebooks, and what appeared to be practice tests spread between them. "If the property taxes are increasing faster than the average income in the area," David was saying, pointing to something in Carmen's real estate study guide, "wouldn't that eventually price out the existing community?" Carmen beamed at him. "Exactly. That's why sustainable development has to consider long-term community impact, not just immediate profits. You're really getting this, David." Richard paused in the doorway, struck by the scene. David was helping Carmen study for her real estate licensing exam, and from what Richard could observe, his 16-year-old son was grasping complex economic concepts that some of Richard's own employees struggled with. "How's the studying going?" Richard asked, entering the kitchen. "Really well," Carmen replied, gathering her papers with a slightly embarrassed smile. "David's been incredibly helpful. He has such a good grasp of market dynamics." Carmen's taking her licensing exam next month, David said proudly. "She's going to ace it. She knows more about ethical real estate practices than most people who've been in the business for years." Richard pulled out a chair and sat down with them. What kind of ethical practices? Carmen's eyes lit up with passion, the same way David's did when he talked about something he cared about. Well, for example, there are ways to develop properties that actually strengthen communities instead of displacing them. Mixed-income housing, preserving local businesses, creating public spaces that bring people together. The thing is, David added, leaning forward with enthusiasm, Carmen's not just thinking about passing the test. She's thinking about how to use real estate to actually help people. Richard found himself genuinely interested in Carmen's perspective. Over the past few months, he'd started seeing her differently. Not as someone who worked for his family, but as someone with her own dreams, intelligence, and insights that had value beyond her role in their household. "Have you thought about what kind of position you'd want after you get licensed?" Richard asked. Carmen hesitated, glancing at David before answering. "I'd love to work with first-time homebuyers, especially families who think home ownership is out of reach. There are so many programs and options available, but most people don't know about them or don't have someone to guide them through the process." "That's an underserved market," Richard mused. "Most agents focus on higher-priced properties because the commissions are better." "Exactly," Carmen said, her voice warming with excitement. "But imagine if you could build a business model that made it profitable to help families achieve home ownership even at lower price points. Higher volume, community relationships, referrals from satisfied clients who tell their friends and family." Richard was impressed despite himself. Carmen had clearly thought this through from multiple angles. "That's actually a smart business strategy." David grinned. "I told you Carmen was brilliant." "Dad!" A few days later, Richard was having lunch with his business partner, Tony, when the conversation turned to staffing challenges at their real estate firm. "We need fresh blood," Tony was saying, cutting into his expensive steak. "Someone who can connect with younger clients. Maybe work the first-time buyer market that we've been neglecting." Richard found himself thinking about Carmen's passion for helping families achieve home ownership. "I might have someone in mind." "Oh, yeah? Someone. With experience?" "Someone with vision," Richard said carefully, "and the kind of work ethic most of our current agents could learn from." That evening, Richard approached Carmen as she was finishing up her daily work. She was in the living room, watering the plants that had somehow made the formal space feel more alive and welcoming. "Carmen, could we talk for a moment?" "Of course," she said, setting down the watering can. "Is everything all right?" "More than all right. I wanted to ask you something." Richard felt uncharacteristically nervous. "When you pass your licensing exam, and I have no doubt you will, would you consider coming to work for my firm?" Carmen's eyes widened with surprise. What?" "We've been looking for someone to develop our first-time buyer division. Someone who understands that market and has the passion to really serve those clients. After hearing you talk about your goals, I think you'd be perfect for it." Carmen sat down slowly, as if the offer was too big to process while standing. "Mr. Blackwood, Richard, I don't know what to say." "Dad!" David's voice came from the kitchen doorway. He'd obviously been listening, and his face was glowing with excitement. "Carmen, this is amazing!" "I'd start you part-time while you're getting established," Richard continued. "Full marketing support, administrative help, and a commission structure that makes it profitable to work with first-time buyers." Carmen's eyes filled with tears. This is more than I ever hoped for. But are you sure? I mean, I don't have any actual sales experience yet." "You have something more valuable than experience," Richard said, meaning it completely. You have integrity and genuine care for people. Those can't be taught. David practically bounced into the room. Carmen, you have to say yes. This is your dream job. Carmen looked between Richard and David, her expression cycling through disbelief, gratitude, and something that looked like hope. Yes, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I would love that opportunity. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Richard had experienced in his own home. David hugged Carmen. Margaret appeared from somewhere and immediately started asking excited questions about the new job, and suddenly everyone was talking at once about possibilities and plans, watching his family. And yes, Richard realized, Carmen had somehow become part of their family. Celebrate together, Richard felt a profound shift in his understanding of success. For years, he'd measured achievement in dollars and deals closed. But seeing David's pride in Carmen's opportunity, witnessing Margaret's genuine happiness, and feeling his own satisfaction at being able to offer someone a chance to pursue their dreams. This felt like success in a way that quarterly profit reports never had. 6 months later, Richard stood in the conference room of his real estate firm, looking at the numbers on the quarterly report with genuine amazement. Carmen had exceeded every expectation. She'd closed more first-time buyer transactions in her first 6 months than most agents closed in a full year. More importantly, her client satisfaction scores were off the charts. How does she do it? Tony asked, shaking his head in wonderment. Her clients act like she's family, not just their real estate agent. Richard smiled, thinking about Carmen's approach to her work. She treated every client the way she'd treated David, with genuine interest, patience, and the belief that their dreams mattered. She makes people feel heard, he said simply. But the most remarkable change wasn't in Carmen's career success. It was in David. Richard's son had blossomed into someone Richard was proud to know, not just proud to have raised. David volunteered at a local community center where Carmen's daughter Tiffany participated in after-school programs. He'd started a tutoring program for younger students at his prep school. Most importantly, he'd developed a confidence and sense of purpose that radiated from everything he did. The transformation in their family dynamics was equally profound. Dinner conversations now ranged from David's latest volunteer project to Carmen's client success stories to Richard's own evolving thoughts about responsible development practices. Margaret had started volunteering at a literacy program, inspired by Carmen's example of balancing work with community service. One evening in December, nearly a year after Richard had first discovered Carmen and David in the kitchen, the four of them were decorating the Christmas tree together. It had become a new tradition, one that Richard treasured more than any of the elaborate holiday parties they used to host. Carmen, David said, carefully hanging an ornament he'd made in a pottery class Carmen had encouraged him to take. Remember when you first started working here and you told me that cooking was about putting love into the food? I remember, Carmen said, smiling at the memory. I think that's what you've done for our whole family, David continued, his voice serious despite his youth. You put love into everything, the way you listen, the way you care about people's dreams, the way you make everyone feel like they matter. Carmen's eyes filled with tears, and Richard felt his own throat tighten with emotion. You know what the funny thing is? Richard said, surprising himself by speaking up. I thought I was doing Carmen a favor by offering her a job, but really she did us the favor. She gave us back our family. Margaret reached over and squeezed Richard's hand. She reminded us what really matters. As they finished decorating the tree, Richard reflected on how completely his definition of success had changed. A year ago, he would have said, success meant closing the biggest deals, making the most money, building the largest portfolio. Now he understood that real success was measured in relationships, in the positive impact you had on other people's lives, in the love and laughter that filled your home. Looking at David, who was now confident, compassionate, and excited about his future, Richard realized that Carmen hadn't just helped his son discover who he was meant to be. She'd helped Richard discover the father he was meant to be, the husband he was meant to be, and the man he was meant to be. The tycoon who had once measured his worth in dollars and square footage now understood that the most valuable thing he owned wasn't any piece of property or business deal. It was the warmth of a home filled with people who genuinely cared about each other, and the knowledge that love really could transform everything, if you were brave enough to let it.